I think life is a beautiful gift, a brief, brilliant moment to explore a strange and wonderful universe. But is there objective reason to think that the good in life really does outweigh the bad? In this conversation, I speak with philosopher David Benatar, best known for his antinatalist view that coming into existence is always a harm for sentient beings, and that it would have been better never to have been born. We discuss his reasoning and the evidence behind his position. Now, I'll be upfront, I haven't changed my mind to his way of thinking, but the conversation really did give me pause. It made me reflect on why I believe what I do and what truly makes life worthwhile, as well perhaps as how I can increase those moments of joy, both for myself and for others. One quick note, around the 20-minute mark, we briefly talk past one another. And so, right at the end, I've added a short clarification for those interested. And now, here's David Benatar. I hope you enjoy.
Escaped Sapiens.
So let's start with the really basic question. What is antinatalism? And in particular, what is your brand of antinatalism?
Well, I think broadly it's the view that it is wrong to bring new sentient beings into existence. And you can use that term in lesser and more robust ways. So, for example, you might have somebody who wants to really just discourage procreation in the sense of have people have fewer children than they otherwise would. That's a sort of light sense of antinatalism. But typically, antinatalists believe that all procreation is morally wrong, at least for moral agents. And moral agents ought not to breed other sentient beings.
Mm-hmm. But so your own position is it absolute? So in the sense that, and by absolute I mean even when you're speaking to me, would it have been better for me personally if I had never been born, even if I deny that's the case?
Yes, I think your parents did something wrong in bringing you into existence.
And
not that I would go and tell them that.
Well, you are telling them that. They might even listen to this.
Well, their son asked, and so now I said, but it wouldn't. It's not that I'd go around saying to people who pushing what we call a pram. I wouldn't say, well, you really shouldn't have had that baby. Stop them on the street, tap them on the shoulder, and say you shouldn't have had that baby.
And what about if we take it to the extreme? So I actually know the answer to this because I've listened to a few of your interviews, but when it comes to human extinction, let's say, for example, everyone agreed with you and they decided just not to have children and we went quietly into extinction, that would be, in your view, a positive thing.
Well, I think the state of extinction would be a positive thing. I certainly think there'd be lots of suffering on the way to extinction. Fully recognize that. And some people want to take that as an argument against antinatalism. But I think there are a few things to be said in response to that. The one is that it's more than extraordinarily unlikely that everybody's going to decide to stop having children on the basis of antinatalist arguments. And so this is not a real implication of anybody deciding not to have children. It's only a hypothetical implication if everybody were to decide not to have children. But the second point is that humanity will at some point go extinct. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just a question of whether it happens, it's a question of when it happens. And the later it happens, the more suffering there's going to be on the way.
I see. And I want to get into balancing that suffering against pleasure and so on during the conversation. But just because this is something I've never heard anyone ask you before. Let's say, for example, the two of us were out for a beer or something. We're talking about a completely different topic and I collapse in front of you on the ground. Would you resuscitate me?
If I could, I would, yes. Because I think there's a difference between coming into existence and going out of existence. So whereas I think that coming into existence is a harm, I also think that going out of existence is a harm. Death is a harm. And so antinatalism does not imply, as some people have suggested, suicide or murder or any of those things. In fact, if you have my reasons for being an antinatalist, then you would have reasons to save people's lives.
Mm-hmm. Even if those people are going to subsequently go on to have children and then give birth to generations of suffering?
Well, those are separate decisions which they make. And they're going to be responsible for those decisions.
I see.
But I think the rule upon ought to operate on is preventing somebody's death in most circumstances. There can be exceptions. I think that people can reach a condition of of such extreme suffering that it's actually not in their overall interests to continue living. So I certainly allow the possibility for euthanasia, for assisted dying in certain circumstances. I just don't think it's a routine solution to the problem of having been brought into existence. And for that reason, the common response to antinatalists, which is to say, well, why don't you just kill yourselves, is both flippant and callous.
I see. So it's not a position where you hate humanity or something along these lines. That's a completely separate. You can be antinatalist and be very positive towards humanity.
Yes, look, I do differentiate between different kinds of antinatalist arguments, categories of antinatalist argument. I think the most compelling ones are what I call the philanthropic ones. And those are arguments that are concerned with the being that you would bring into existence. There are also what I call misanthropic arguments for antinatalism. And those are arguments that speak about the negative effect that creating a child will have on other beings, not on the child that you create, but on other beings. And so some environmental arguments, for example, fall into this category. So somebody might say, well, if I were to produce a child, this would be another consumer, another person contributing to the degradation of the environment. That would harm existing people, it would harm existing animals and future people, and so I ought not to create that child. That's a misanthropic argument. But I am quick to note that the philanthropic and the misanthropic are not incompatible with one another. In other words, one could be motivated by both things. And in fact, some environmentalists are motivated by both. They say, if I were to bring a child into existence, it would be in this degraded environment where its life would be worse than it otherwise would be. And so that's a reason not to create the child. But it would also then contribute to the further destruction of the environment. And so there's now a further reason to not create this child. So although I use the term misanthropic, it's not laden with a hatred of humanity. It's only acknowledging the damage that humans do generally tend to do.
I see. But so I think you're most famous for your philanthropic arguments, right? So in particular, the asymmetry arguments and the bias arguments that you go through. And so that's kind of what I want to touch on today, if we can. Certainly.
Yes, I am primarily motivated by the philanthropic arguments because I think they're the most fundamental arguments. And I also think they're the ones that produce the most categorical conclusion against procreation. The misanthropic arguments really tend to call for a reduction in human population as opposed to a complete cessation of all procreation.
I see. So this topic, it sort of makes me personally uneasy, right? Because I would line up far more heavily on the pro-natalist side. This whole podcast is about the brilliant things that humans are doing, the science and technology that's being developed, and sort of the future that we could be striving towards. And so what I want to do is I want to ask you very carefully about this topic, because I'm the sort of person who's going to misunderstand your position, I think, from the outset. So I want to very carefully go through it, starting with the asymmetry arguments that you bring on board. Could you start by maybe outlining what your asymmetry argument is, just at a foundational level?
Well, the fundamental asymmetry argument is what I call an axiological asymmetry argument. So that is an asymmetry of value. There's also an empirical asymmetry, which I'll come to in a while. But the axiological asymmetry points to the difference between the presence of pain and pleasure and the absence of pain and pleasure. So I think that it's uncontroversial to say that the presence of pain is something bad. Now, I'm speaking here about intrinsic badness. I'm not denying that there might be some instrumental good from pain. If you have a toothache and you go to the dentist and you get a problem nipped in the bud, that can be instrumentally good. But pain is going to be intrinsically bad. Mm-hmm. And pleasure, I think, is intrinsically good. Again, there may be instrumental badness to pleasure, but it's going to be intrinsically good. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the absence of pain, and by the way, when I speak about pleasure and pain, I'm using these as placeholders for harms and benefits more generally. Just a sort of hedonistic instance of the broader point. If we think about the absence of pain, I think that's good, even if there is nobody to experience that absence. So if you could have created a child and you don't, the absent pain that results from your decision not to create the child, that's good. The absence of that is good. But when it comes to the absence of pleasure, I think that's not bad unless there is somebody for whom it is a deprivation. So if, for example, you are deprived of some pleasure you could have or some other good you could have, then that absence is bad. But if the reason why there's no pleasure is because there's no person, then I think the absence of the pleasure is not bad. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a very fundamental asymmetry, and I think it explains a lot of views that people hold. And I also think that it can do a lot of explanatory work in our thinking about population ethics problems and problems of future people and an array of other things. But when people see where it leads, namely to antinatalism, then I think they suddenly become resistant to the axiological asymmetry. And one of the things that I do in Better Never to Have Been is to go through very methodically a whole range of attempts somebody might make to establish symmetry, to avoid the asymmetry, and argue that each of those fail.
I see. And so when you say it's axiological, so you're stating these. So you're stating these. This is just by axiom. You're saying this is true, but this is where I start from, and then I can derive outcomes from these starting points.
No. So let me just clarify. Axiological is different from axiomatic.
Okay.
So these are not assumptions. Axiology is the study of value. Mm-hmm. And so an axiological claim is a value claim. So when I say that the presence of pleasure is good, I'm attaching an evaluation to the presence of that pleasure. It's to be distinguished, for example, from a logical point. So I'm not making a logical claim. I'm making an axiological claim. Because somebody could just, as a matter of logic, say that these things are entirely symmetrical. You can have the presence of pain and the absence of pain, and the presence of pleasure and the absence of pleasure. And there you've got perfect symmetry. But when you attach an evaluation to each of those facts, I'm saying you need to attach an asymmetrical evaluation, because I think it's true, but I think it also has lots of explanatory value.
But so where did the argument arise from? So how did you get to this asymmetry argument? What was the starting point?
Well, I mean, there's two different ways of interpreting your question. The one is sort of biographically, how did you come to the idea? And then the other is, what reasons do you have for supporting the idea?
I think the first one is what I'm interested in.
Well, I don't think you should be. I think you should be more interested in the second one. Because, I mean, if Archimedes gets in the bath and displaces the water, that's going to tell you something about how he came to the idea. But that's not a reason for any of us to accept it. It's whatever subsequent work he did to demonstrate displacement of water that would be important for us accepting the principle of displacement. So it strikes me as obvious that this asymmetry is true, but of course it strikes other people as obviously false, at least when they see where it leads. And so it doesn't matter really how you personally, whether you were struck in the moment by the idea. What matters is what arguments are there for it. Now, of course, because we're in the realm of axiology here, we're not in the realm of mathematics, there can be no knockdown proofs. There can't be some proof that is just absolutely unavoidable by any rational person. But we can't expect that kind of proof in this area. So what we have to really look at is the balance of evidence and arguments. And so one of the things I say I do in the book is try to spell out the implications of rejecting one or other features of this asymmetry in an attempt to establish symmetry, and then see where it leads you. So some people, for example, will want to say, well, the absence of pleasure because there's a non-existent person, that is bad. But that's now going to provide strong evidence for your thinking that you ought to be creating people who will have pleasure in their lives, at least on some views, if the pleasure outweighs the pain. And that's typically not the view that most people hold. Most people think that while you would have a duty not to bring into existence a child who would suffer unbearably, they don't think that you have a duty to bring into existence a child who'd be a blessed child, as it were.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that's because of the circumstances in which we live? I mean, there are lots of people on the planet right now. Let's say, for example, we lived in completely different circumstances where we didn't get to routinely interact with other people and we desired to have interactions. Then maybe in those circumstances, we may really value bringing in more people or bringing more people into existence.
Well, that argument you've just given is one rooted in the interests of existing people by definition. So the existing people want more people so that they can interact with them. So that's not an argument that considers whether being brought into existence is good for the being who is created. Mm-hmm. But if we set that point aside, I think, yes, people have in the past, and some do now still think that there's some duty to create people, but I don't think that is rooted in the interests of the being that they're going to create. They do it because they think that God has told them to be fruitful and multiply, or because their dear leader has told them to produce more people for their nation. So there are lots of these other reasons that have nothing to do with the interests of the being that you're going to create. And those are separate questions that we can come to later. What I'm primarily interested in is it in the interests of the being who you create to bring them into existence? And that's where we want to know whether the absent pleasures that result from our not creating them, is that bad or not bad? Mm-hmm. And one reason we have for thinking that it's not bad is that if it were bad, then there would be quite strong reasons to create more and more people up to the point where you've created so many that now their quality of life is going to be too bad. Mm-hmm. So if you have one child, you ought not to have two, assuming you can afford to have two. And if you have two, you need to have three if you can afford to have three. And that's not a view that most people hold. But this is not the only data that we have for accepting the axiological asymmetry. I don't think we can get into all the details here. I'd encourage people just to look at the book, but there are the whole slew of problems to do with population ethics and future people. And one of the things I show in the book, or argue, is that all of these problems, which are otherwise intractable, which philosophers have had immense difficulty trying to deal with, they're all resolvable if you accept my view. And that's certainly got to be a point in favor of the axiological asymmetry and also of antinatalism.
Mm-hmm. But so the asymmetry does run against my intuitions at a deeper level, right? It's not the eventual outcome that really worries me. So if I picture, say, a room that's filled with pain, say a torture room where there's beings in that room suffering, and then I compare that room to an empty room, I of course see the empty room as preferable to the room filled with suffering. But in a similar way, if I had a room, if I now fill this room with pure bliss and sentient beings to enjoy that bliss, my view is that I prefer the second one, even if I'm not in the room to experience the bliss. Like I prefer that room full of life. So what am I misunderstanding here about the asymmetry?
I wonder whether what you're imagining when you compare those two rooms is that there are people there in the one room and in the other they're not. And so you're sort of imagining that fun that somebody could be having in that room is not being had, because instead of people all partying in the room, they're somewhere else. In other words, that might be one of the things that's going on. Because let me put another question to you. How much time do you spend worrying about all the pleasure that's not taking place on Mars or Jupiter or Saturn or Mercury?
As much time as I think about the pain, right? So I think as much about the pleasure as I do about the pain. But I mean, I'm the wrong person to ask this particular question to, because I would much rather live in a universe that has sentient beings out in Alpha Centauri or somewhere else, even if I don't ever get to experience interacting with them. I like the idea of beings exploring the universe and enjoying the universe, even separate to me, if that makes sense.
So you can like that idea, but if they're not there to explore the universe and understand the universe, who's losing out?
Well, no one.
Well, then that's the point. There's nobody who's missing out, and that seems to be important to the evaluation. So if you have the impulse to discover and to explore, and that is frustrated in some way because you put in a gulag or a prison, or you live in a society that doesn't allow free inquiry and you can't do all of those things, then that is going to frustrate you, and that I fully acknowledge is bad. But fulfilling a desire to explore is only good if there is a desire to explore. And if there's no desire to explore, because there's no person to have that desire, I just think that's not bad.
But could I just say that fulfilling the desire not to have pain and then flip the argument? Like, I don't, there's something that I'm fundamentally misunderstanding about the asymmetry, I think.
Well, you can flip the argument. You can flip the argument logically, and just say, yes, the absence of pain is not good. You can say that. Logically, you can say that. But that's going to have axiological or evaluative implications. So now you need to think about a couple that are considering having a child, but let's say they know as a result of genetic testing that this child is going to suffer unusually badly by human standards. Now you're going to need to say, well, there's no reason not to create that child.
I see. So, but why is that the case? Because in the case where I do create the child, they're now in a state of existence where they're suffering. And if I weigh up that suffering against the pleasure they have, and if that suffering is, there's still something. I mean, this is very difficult for you to tease out what I'm misunderstanding, right? It could be any number of things. But there's just something at a fundamental level that I really struggle with the argument. I understand comparing two universes, one with the child and one without the child. But I think the main thing that interests me is that you can follow the logic along and then derive things that probably I would agree with if I started with your starting point, right? There probably are things that I would agree with if we hit enough topics. I mean, we don't have unlimited time here, unfortunately.
Yeah, so let me try and put the point in a different way in the hope that we can connect on this. Mm-hmm. So is it better or worse to create the suffering child?
Worse.
Okay, it's worse. Now, is it better or worse to create the happy child?
Better.
Why? Because
the child will experience happiness and experience joy and all the positive things.
Yeah, but if you don't create the child, is there anything that anybody is being deprived of?
No, but if I'm just comparing the two universes, I think it's a richer, nicer universe if someone does exist to experience the joy and happiness for that person.
Why?
I mean,
you don't think that's coming from a bias on your part, that you're a sentient being, you're here, you're enjoying certain things, and now you think, well, I'd like somebody else to enjoy that. Now, it makes perfect sense to want somebody else to enjoy it, but there are two different ways in which somebody else can enjoy it. There can be somebody else there who's not enjoying it, and then they come to enjoy it. Or it can be that you now create a person with the need to enjoy it, which may or may not then be fulfilled.
Mm-hmm. So
here's another way of putting it. Sorry, okay.
At the risk of it not being fulfilled, I honestly do prefer the universe where someone is brought into being to enjoy the fruits of the universe.
But you see, I'm wondering how you explain that. Because obviously, if I say to people, do you think it's good for the child to be brought into existence? There are people who say that, and people who think that. The question is whether that is a confused view or not.
It might be. It might be a confused view based on, my imagination of someone who does exist, then going from their place of not enjoying something to, going and smelling the flower.
Yeah, that's exactly, I think, what's going on. And I've got some evidence for this. I once did an empirical study asking people about counterfactual conditions pertaining to their own existence. So, for example, one question was, do you prefer to have been born the sex you are? Would you prefer to have been born the opposite sex, or are you indifferent? And as I expected, most people are happy to have prefer to have been born the sex that they are.
How convenient,
of course,
right?
Yeah, exactly. There are exceptions, but that's how most people answer, as I hypothesized. But what that suggests to me is that most people are not actually thinking about the counterfactual case. What they're thinking about is, I was born the sex I am, and now they having difficulty imagining themselves being another sex because their reference point is the current sex that they have. And so they report to you that it's better, they prefer having been born the sex that they are. But if they genuinely did the counterfactual, the conclusion they should reach is that they're indifferent, because if they put themselves in the shoes of most people of the opposite sex, then they would realize that they would be happy being the opposite sex. And so the right answer is probably something approaching indifference. Mm-hmm. Maybe not in all cases. I know there are people who want to be a gender of an opposite kind, and there are some sex differences between men and women. More women would prefer to have been men than men would have preferred to have been women, and there are explanations that are given for those preferences by people. But as an overall point, I think people are not actually considering the counterfactual case. And I think the same is true about a preference to have been born, is they're imagining themselves effectively ceasing to exist as opposed to never having existed.
Mm-hmm. And so in your plot, how should I interpret the scale here? So let's say I agree, or let's say, just for the sake of conversation, we agree on this starting point that there is an asymmetry. How should I interpret the scale? So is this one instance of pleasure, lined up against one instance of pain in some units, or is this the pain across an entire life? How should I interpret that scale?
Well, it's all the pain that would have been in the life and all the pleasure that would have been in the life. But if you apply the asymmetry, then you need to reach the conclusion. And many people find this counterintuitive, and I'll explain why they needn't. But if you apply the asymmetry, you're going to reach the conclusion that so long as there is any pain in a life or any harm in a life, it's going to be better never to have been. And people find that counterintuitive. But remember, if there were only some very modest amount of pain, that wouldn't produce the antinatalist conclusion, because the axiological asymmetry is not enough to produce antinatalism. If, for example, creating a person created a very small amount of harm to the person created, but there was significant benefits to others, then it may well be justifiable to create a child. And that is the kind of rationale that's used in much pediatric research. So it holds no benefit, or could be expected to hold no benefit for the child on whom the research is done. But if the harm to that child is minimal, then the fact that there are very profound benefits for other people is widely thought to be a justification for conducting the pediatric research. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think that the actual world is like that. I don't think that when you create somebody, it is just a very small amount of harm that they experience. I think it's actually quite substantial, and we can speak a bit more about that in a while. But if it were, the conclusion that it would have been better never to have been would apply, but the antinatalism conclusion wouldn't apply. Mm-hmm. Antinatalism, you've got to go a step further just to see how much suffering and harm there is in a life.
I see. But so to look at an almost perfect life. So let's say, for example, someone lives in complete bliss and they're so happy that they're dancing all the time, and one day they stub their toe because of all the joyous dancing, and they momentarily have 5 minutes of toe pain. So even in that case, which you claim is not realistic, but even in that case, you would say the asymmetry argument holds, and from that argument, it follows that it would have been better for that person not to have had their life of rapturous joy. Well,
first of all, let me just push your case a bit further, because does this person eventually die?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's a pretty serious harm just by itself. So wrapping our head around your case is quite a hard thing to do. In other words,
But
if you think that death
sorry.
is a serious harm, then it's not just stubbing a toe; it's stubbing a toe and then dying later.
Right, but I mean, a good thing that ends doesn't become bad because it ends, right? I enjoy watching a movie, although I know it's going to end.
Well, again, see, I think that's disanalogous because once you're here, you can either get the benefit of a movie or not. And the other thing, of course, about a movie is that if it went on too long, it would cease to be enjoyable for other reasons. And there are some people who claim that about life too. That's a separate argument. But I think there's a compelling philosophical case to be made that if there were enough variety in a life of indefinite length, that would be better than a life where you die after 70 or 80 or 90 years. So I think death is a pretty serious harm. And if you do think that, then the case you've got to imagine is not just stubbing your toe. You've got to imagine stubbing your toe and then dying. So when you create that child, you're inflicting on it the future death that's going to befall it. Now, ordinarily, we don't think that killing people and allowing them to die is a flippant matter. And I don't think that we ought to think that not quite killing, but it's creating, it's at least allowing to die. The very least, it's allowing to die when you create somebody. I don't think that's a flippant matter either.
So weighing up a situation in which someone's not brought into existence and you avoid the pain of death against a life of 90 years of pure bliss and stubbing the toe and then dying at the end, the argument is that the scenario in which no one exists in which to suffer from the pain should outweigh the scenario in which they are brought into existence and they have this life of almost pure bliss. The suffering is the main thing you should be trying to avoid.
I think that's true. There's some qualifications I'd want to put on the precise formulation, but let me put it in my way. It's that even if life contained only minimal harm and a large amount of benefit, it would still be better never to come into existence. But it would not follow that anybody had done something wrong in creating you. That requires further argument.
I see. And so what about making this? So is there any test that you could do? So you said earlier, because it's axiological, there's no test which would sort of snuff out the argument, right? You can't go away and absolutely say that this could be ruled out. Is that the case?
Yes, you can't give a mathematical proof for this. But then, of course, there are different standards of evidence in different sciences. So I don't know. You probably don't get as much precision in some of the harder sciences as you do in mathematics, and then you're not going to get as much precision in the social sciences as you get in the life sciences. And so there are going to be degrees of proof, as it were, that you're going to have to accept vary from discipline to discipline. And I don't think we can have knockdown arguments here, but I think we can have conclusions that are supported by a balance of evidence, a balance of considerations. But then to make that kind of evaluation, you need to consider the full array of considerations.
Mm-hmm. So then if from your starting point, what would you say are the strongest derived, what would you call them? Facts, not the derived effects or logical consequences that you would like to outline? And I'll ask that question first because there's a few different points that I want to touch on.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you clarify?
Yeah. So let's say that you start with your asymmetry argument. What are the clearest logical consequences that you hold to be true, which you can derive from that starting point?
Well, one of them is, I think, that it's always a harm to come into existence. That's the central one. But then that asymmetry, sometimes combined with the antinatalism, for which I've not given the full argument yet, can also solve these population problems. So if you think about, for example, what's called the non-identity problem. So the non-identity problem runs something like this. The famous way it's presented is there's a 12-year-old girl. She could have a baby now that would have a really suboptimum life, or she could delay pregnancy, let's say, by 5 years and have a baby that would be much better off. Mm-hmm. Now, in those two scenarios, the baby that she produces are different babies. And so the question is, does she do anything wrong if she has the baby now when she's 12? Now, we assume, for the sake of argument, that it has what is called a life worth living. I'm putting that in scare quotes because I think that's a problematic phrase and it's ambiguous. But you see it as a life worth living. It's much less good a life than the other child would have if she were to procreate later. And it's really hard to say how she does anything wrong. Really hard to say how she harms the child by creating the child. And this is because we have what's called a non-identity situation, where either a different being comes into existence in the two different scenarios. So you think about this child she has when she's 12, and you ask, well, has she harmed the child? And some people want to say, well, what's harm? It's making somebody worse off than they otherwise would have been. And then they want to say, oh, but they wouldn't otherwise have been. Because if she didn't create this child would not otherwise have been. And so this child can't be worse off than it would otherwise have been, and therefore it can't be harmed. And that's a problem. It's a big dilemma. It's how do you handle cases of this kind? But if you accept my view, then everybody who's brought into existence is harmed. And so you're going to say, well, she has harmed. And then now it's a question about how much you're harming. So she's harming the first possible child more than she's harming the second possible child. But in both cases, she's harming a child. And I can multiply this. There are all these different considerations, all these different problems, which I think become resolvable if you accept various details of my argument, but starting off with the axiological asymmetry.
Mm-hmm. And then why is it that reported happiness with someone's life is not the main category of interest?
Well, I think it should be for decisions about ceasing to exist. Mm-hmm. So if you've got some disease and you're suffering, and I look at you and I think, gee, I would not want to go through that. I'd have reached my limit by this point, and I'd want assisted suicide or assisted dying at this point. Then I think you could be wrong about whether it's worth your while continuing. But I think decision-making authority must lie in your hands because you're the one who's leading that life. And if you're making an erroneous decision, you're the one who's going to suffer. That's a totally different scenario from the one we're considering when you're bringing somebody into existence, because now you're making a decision about somebody else's life. Mm-hmm. And you're judging on the basis of your evaluation whether it's better for them to be created or not be created. Mm-hmm. And I think what complicates the matter further is that we've got very good reason for thinking that there are evolutionary selected forces that are going to lead most people to judge the quality of their life to be better than it actually is. Mm-hmm. Because people who either have a realistic view of how bad the quality of life is, or who have an unduly pessimistic view about the quality of life, are less likely to survive and to breed. And so there's going to be a selection force in favor of the optimists, as it were. And so if we've got eons and eons of evolutionary selection towards the view that it's better, it's good to come into existence and good to be alive, then I don't know how much we should trust that. And I think we do have quite good psychological evidence that, for example, there is a general optimism bias among human beings, that when people adapt to their conditions, and so they sort of airbrush out of the picture certain negative things, and also comparison. They compare themselves to others. And then, again, you get an airbrushing here. So when you look around you and you see that nobody really lives beyond 90 or 100, or very rare cases 105, or then you think, well, I've reached 90 now. That's pretty good. Whereas if you looked around you and you saw most people living to 300 and 400 and 500, and you had a terminal disease at 90, you'd say, gee, this isn't going so well. So you have a reference class and you compare yourself to them. And to the extent that everybody's in the same boat, you just have a discounting of those kinds of evils.
Is there a risk that by promoting these sorts of views that people who are predisposed to agree with them won't breed, and so we will be left with a population that has an even larger bias?
That's a possibility. I mean, these are the kinds of consequences down the line that you just can't predict. But it's really a case of a bird in the hand, I think, versus two in the bush. So if you're contemplating procreation, that's a massive decision in your hands, and you can either ensure that the child you would create is not created and therefore won't suffer and won't die. Or you can say, well, I'm going to have this child because maybe it's going to contribute in some imperceptible way to humanity having a more realistic picture of the universe down the line. There's a very tangible benefit on the one hand versus a very speculative one down the line.
So, just one second. I had a follow up to this, and you just made me laugh.
That's good too.
I've just had my brain wiped. I don't know.
Sure, no problem. No problem. Take a moment. I'm sure you can edit this.
No, I can definitely edit this. I'm going to edit it to make you just say completely false things. No, so oh God, what has happened to my brain? Just give me a second, sorry.
Sure, no problem, no pressure.
Oh, that's right. So when it comes to the tests then, so you said there's evidence to suggest that we have this bias. What do the tests actually look like? Is the outcome of those tests that we have a bias, or that in aggregate we can say that most people do have lives which are on balance filled with more pain?
Well, my argument really goes in two stages. I'm not sure both stages are necessary, but the first stage may not be necessary, is to indicate why I think we cannot trust self-reports on quality of life. Mm-hmm. And then the second stage is to point out why we've got really good reason for thinking that there's much more harm in lives than people think, and why, in fact, there's much more harm than good, much more harm than benefit. Let's look first at why people's judgments are unreliable, and let's look specifically perhaps at the optimism bias. This is generally aggregative research, not entirely, but generally. So, for example, people will be showed a series of faces. One is a really smiley face, and then a slightly less smiley face, and slightly less, and then it goes all the way down to a really frowny face. And then people are asked, where on this spectrum are you? And most people will put themselves towards the happy end of the spectrum. Now, we haven't got there yet. Then people will ask, well, what's the quality of your life? Is it above average? Is it below average? Is it average? Well, it turns out most people think the quality of their life is above average. That's sort of problematic on an aggregative level. Then there's sort of memory tests. So people will be regularly paged to ask how they're feeling in the moment. And then later on, they'll be asked, how was the past day or the past week or the past month? And people's recollection of the bad tends to not be as good as their recollection of the good. And so they misrecollecting how much good and bad there's been in the formulation of their judgment about how things are going. Some of these tests are prospective. People are asked at a certain stage in their life, where do you think you'll be personally and professionally in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time? And then there's a follow-up later to see how things are, and it's really as good as people projected. So there's a lot of evidence for a generalized optimism bias. That's not to say that everybody is liable to that bias. I don't think that's true. There's some people who have a more realistic take. And then I think there's some people even who have an unduly pessimistic view. They're more pessimistic than reality would require. But there's pretty good evidence of an optimism bias.
But so when it comes to pleasure and pain, these are derived quantities, right? There's no atom of pleasure or atom of pain, right? It only really exists in our brains. And so perception, in my mind, is everything, right? And if people are perceiving their lives to be better than they are, that could indicate that we're just well adapted to dealing with pain, and so pain is not the important metric, right? It could be that, this is a sign that actually that's not the important quantity to have in the plot, in the asymmetry plot, that is.
Well, remember, pleasure and pains are just placeholders for harms and benefits more generally. And so now we come to the next part of the argument, which is whether we should think that there's more good or bad, more harm or benefit within a life. And this is going to depend on what standard you use for judging quality of life. And philosophers have different views on this. There are three broad categories of view. The one is a hedonistic view, which suggests that a life goes better to the extent that it has more positive experiences and fewer negative experiences. Then you get what are called desire satisfaction views, which say that a life goes better to the extent that one's desires are satisfied and not thwarted. And just to clarify here, desires here, the fulfillment of a desire is not necessarily a subjective state. So you could desire that things be a certain way. You could desire that your spouse be faithful to you, and that desire is fulfilled if your spouse is faithful to you, even if you've got deep suspicions that she's not. And on the other hand, your wife could be unfaithful to you, and you think that she is, so you don't have any negative states, but your desire is not fulfilled. So it's important to distinguish the desire fulfillment theory from the hedonistic theory. And then there's what's called objective list theories. And objective list theories say life goes better to the extent that you have all the things on an objective list of good, or you have more things on an objective list of goods. And of course, objective list theorists are going to disagree about what precisely is on the list of objective goods. Now, I don't choose between those views. What I try to show is that irrespective of which view you take, you should reach the conclusion that there's more harm than benefit, all things considered. Let's take the hedonistic views, because people are inclined to say exactly what you said, which is, well, I can't be wrong about these things. I can't be wrong about whether I'm in pleasure, having pleasure, whether I'm in pain. And I think the important point about hedonistic views is that your life goes better or worse to the extent that there is more pleasure or there is more pain. And if at a particular time you can be mistaken about how much pleasure or pain there has been, then the subjective evaluation at that moment can be incorrect. So it's correct that you can't be mistaken about whether you are now having pleasure or you are now in pain. Can't be mistaken about that. But you can be mistaken about how much pain or pleasure you have had and how much pain or pleasure you will have.
So then, okay, so let's say, for example, you've sort of touched on this before, but let's say, for example, you send out surveys, and I know you said there've been these tests with pages that go off and people report how good their life is. Let's say, for example, you redid this experiment and you found out, or you did a battery of experiments, and you found out that generally speaking, people were happy of their current state, and they stated that they were very happy to be alive. They want to continue to be alive. If that was the case, experimentally, wouldn't, you say that you should separate the continuing a life versus starting a life, but why don't your arguments for continuing a life sort of have a back reaction on the you get where I'm trying to get to with this question?
Yes. So let me ask you this. This is the analogy I like to think of here. Let's imagine that we could, through genetic modification, breed a slave class of human beings who are actually happy with their servitude. Didn't matter how badly you treated them, and didn't matter how hard you worked them, and they'd be content being slaves. Perhaps in part because they thought, well, if it wasn't this, it was nothing. I wouldn't have been created otherwise. And I want to grab onto every moment. They have these kind of views. I would grab onto every moment of existence. Do you think it'd be morally acceptable to genetically engineer a human who would be a contented slave? And let's imagine somebody, imagine somebody had already done it, and they could keep pointing. Look, there are all these people. They're perfectly happy. If you ask them, they're not unhappy being slaves. Would it be okay for you to get in on the game?
So, so my answer is no. But I don't really know how to attack this, because you're relating slavery to life, right? So you sort of slipped into the argument, this analogy between the two.
No, but but it's not entirely unfair, because what you're wanting to do in the case of existence is to say that we should set aside whatever evidence there might be about how much unpleasantness there is in their life, and just take the self-report as being sufficient.
I see. So you're saying that because I'm robust to suffering doesn't discount the fact that there's suffering there.
Yes, and that it matters morally, and that for somebody to create me for their purposes is problematic. And so I think all of those elements are present in the slavery analogy.
So then I suppose the main point which may save the direction I'm trying to go in is really if there was some objective way of measuring, whether we're slaves or not, right? And you're saying that the evidence that we do have suggests that lives really are more they're weighted more towards suffering than pleasure.
Yeah, I need to say a bit more about that, but that's true. And also, I think that instead of genetic engineering, we've got genetic selection that leads to people endorsing their having been brought into existence. So that's the analogous piece between the slavery case and the ordinary procreation case. But perhaps we should come to the point about why there's more bad than good. And again, there's much to be said here, probably more than we have time for. But let's just think about some examples, and I can start off with pleasure and pain. So there are a lot of empirical asymmetries between harms and benefits, which I think are crucial here. So if you think about chronic pain, a lot of people have chronic pain. There's clearly such a thing as chronic pain, but there's no such thing as chronic pleasure. There can be chronic satisfaction, but there can be chronic dissatisfaction as well. So we're going to get some kind of symmetry there. But chronic pleasure, nobody has that. Think about the worst pains. The worst pains are a lot worse than the best pleasures are good. And we can test that. And we could say to somebody, we offer you a deal. We're going to subject you to the worst pains imaginable for 1 hour in exchange for 23 hours of the most sublime pleasures. Would you take that deal? Well, I don't think that honest, rational people would take that deal. And anybody who was pretending they would, I think we could test it if it would be ethical to do so. Unfortunately, it's not ethical to do so. But we could give them the 1 hour, and I think after 5 minutes they'd probably say, "Oh no, let's stop this."
Can I break in and just ask? Do you think death is of that quality? As in, do you think, because you pointed this out in the example that I gave of the person who stubbed their toe, that they're going to die eventually. Do you think that on its own negates all the pleasures of life? Just the death?
Look, the badness of death is quite a controversial topic in philosophy. There is an argument that death is not bad. Not dying. I mean, dying can be terrible, but that death itself is not bad. So this is the Epicurean school of philosophy that holds this view. I think that actually embracing that view is something that most people don't do and can't do. I think the implications of it, I mean, why would you worry when you cross a train track whether there's an oncoming train if death was a matter of indifference? You'd be killed pretty instantly if you were struck by a train. So it wouldn't be, as deaths go, might be a gruesome death, might be a messy death. That's a problem for somebody else. It would be pretty instant for you.
But
And
I suppose we're evolved to avoid death, right? So maybe the pain is really the fear. I mean, I would imagine that's the suffering that you really go through, is the fear of death. Whereas I've never died. I don't know what the experience is like. But as far as it affects my life, it's the fear of death rather than death itself that affects me on a day-to-day level.
well, that's what the Epicurean is trying to address, trying to say to you, actually, you may have this fear, but you should have no fear. There's no reason to be fearful. And they're trying to give you reasons for why you shouldn't be fearful. And the question is, should you accept those reasons or not? And again, as I've often pointed out, I don't think there's a knockdown argument against the Epicurean. I don't think we can give a decisive refutation of the Epicurean view, which is why it's stuck around for thousands of years. But it doesn't follow that we should accept it. And I have difficulty imagining a life in which somebody really has accepted it and all the implications that it involves. So, I mean, again, can't get into all the details here, but I think we've got quite a good reason for thinking that death is bad. Now, if I'm correct that death is bad, it's not the same kind of bad as being in pain, because that is a subjective state, and the badness of death is about the absence of any subjective states and what it does to the ante-mortem person, the person who existed before death. So it's a different kind of harm. It's not the same kind of harm.
Okay, in light of the time, I want to get on to how it is that these arguments imply that you shouldn't have children, right? So we haven't really touched on that. We've dealt more on with the asymmetry itself. So why is it that this then implies that you shouldn't have children?
Well, I think there are a variety of ways of reaching the antinatalist conclusion. I think that the arguments about how much pain and suffering and harm there is in a life is probably sufficient to rule out procreation. Now, some people might want to argue that not all lives are terrible, that maybe some are not, but then there's going to be a risk argument. So you're saying, well, think about all the lives that are created so that there can be those few relatively blissful lives. That's like a game of Russian roulette, where you're going to subject a whole bunch of people to an undesirable existence so that some people might have a desirable one. That's a problem. There are also consent arguments. So the argument is that you're subjecting, at the very least, your child to significant risk and vulnerability, if not, in fact, to very serious harms. And you do that without the child's consent. Now, of course, you can't get consent. And some people want to say, well, you can't get consent in other cases too. If you've got a child who needs medical treatment, the child can't consent to the medical treatment. And so somebody else needs to decide on behalf of the child. But those are different kinds of cases, because those are cases where you already have a child who has interests and who can either be harmed or benefited through the administration of this medical service. Whereas when you're thinking about producing a child, there's no child there, and it's got no interest in coming into existence. And yet you're going to decide on the child's behalf that imposing these risks and vulnerabilities is acceptable. Mm-hmm. So there are lots of routes, lots of even philanthropic routes to the antinatalist conclusion. But what I would say in summary is that there is this axiological asymmetry. That's not by itself sufficient to produce antinatalism. But when we see just how harmful it is to be brought into existence, it's really hard to see how that can be justified.
So if we look at, there are all sorts of metrics. Like if you look at the rate of poverty or deaths due to war, that there are many metrics you can look at and see that the world is getting better. Let's say there are less people suffering in this particular way, less people dying of that particular cancer, or whatever it is, whatever metric you want to pick. There are metrics that are improving across time, and so if we project out, it could be that we have many, many more people brought into existence in the future than currently live on the planet. And it could be that as time goes on, things continue getting better, and we move towards a place where the majority of people live in aggregate good, pleasurable lives. Aren't we sort of, my view is that we should strive towards a better world rather than switching off the lights. Why is that view wrong?
Well, I don't see why you can't do both. You cannot have children and yet strive to make the world a better place. But let me return to your earlier points. First of all, the claims that are made about improvement are per capita. But per capita improvement, so per capita reduction in violence and things like that. But the more people you have, the more people you have who are succumbing to murder. It may not be per capita, but there are more people who are dying horrible deaths. It's also not clear that there are improvements in other kinds of ways. So, for example, there was a time when humans' life expectancy was rather short. People were tending to die throughout the world from infectious diseases. That for a while got better in the developed world, not so much in the developing world, but in the developed world. But then what you find is many, many more people dying of cancers, and often dying slower and more horrible deaths, albeit later in life, so they get extra life years. But instead of dying relatively quickly from an infectious disease earlier, they die much more slowly from a cancer later. Perhaps there'll be treatments for cancer down the line and we'll avoid that. But then, believe me, people will be dying of something else, and it probably will be pretty horrible too. And of course, we have a resurgence of infectious diseases now too, and we may have even more of that down the line. But let me say, even if I bought into your premise that the future would be much better than the present, the question is whether that justifies having children in the interim. So here you might think about somebody, let's say in the year 500, who's contemplating having a child, and they know that if they have that child and that child needs to have a tooth removed or a limb amputated or any kind of surgery, this is going to have to be done without anesthetic, because there's no such thing as anesthetic. They don't even have a word for anesthetic. They're just going to be subjected to this horrific surgery with horrific pain, maybe a bit of grog or a blow over the head to temporarily alleviate it. But that's what they're subjecting the child to. And let's imagine one of the sort of optimistic philosophers among them says, but I imagine a world in which you can be administered some substance that you either breathe in or is injected into you, and now you can have the surgery without any of these pains. And I'd say, great, that's certainly something to look forward to, but are you really justified in producing all the generations between the year 518, whatever it was, the way anesthetics were discovered, of people who are subjected to surgery without anesthesia? And I just think that is grotesque.
Mm-hmm. But the claim is not that you couldn't get to a position where in aggregate people do live better lives, right? That could be a universe that could exist in the future, but your view is it's not worth the suffering on the way. Is that the case?
In aggregate, it could be better. It could be, but of course, there are no guarantees that it will be, because it could also be worse for all kinds of reasons: environmental changes, infectious diseases. There are any number of reasons why the future might be much, much less rosy than we think it is. And it may even be less good than it is now. But even if there were improvement, I think that harm is so deeply written into the structure of life that we're never going to get to a scenario where we have really blissful lives. They may have lives that people assume to be blissful through their optimism bias or other psychological coping mechanisms, but there's going to be substantial harm.
Mm-hmm. So the claim is that we're not there yet. And because we're not there yet, there's going to be suffering between now and some fictitious point in the future where we might get to, this place where people are living in aggregate better lives, and for those two reasons. Well, those are two key reasons for being an antinatalist in your view.
Yeah, I think there are two optimism biases about the future. The one is how good things will get down the line. I think that's too rosy a picture. And then there's the bias about how much suffering we can tolerate on the way to that.
Mm-hmm. So just final question. Let's end on a positive note. What do you like about life, and what do you think? I know this is a big question. You could have a whole podcast on this, but what does make life good and worth living?
Well, you've asked it in a way personally, and I don't want to answer personal questions. But it so happens that I think the answer to this really varies from person to person. I don't think there's just one way of leading a good life. I think there are an array of ways, and in part, they are determined by individual personalities and also by individual circumstances. And I think once you're here, you should make it as good as possible, and you should lead as good a life as you possibly can. I'm all in favor of that. But what I'm not in favor of is keeping this wheel going, as it were, by producing more beings that need to try to find fulfilling lives that are as devoid of suffering as possible. And it's not a task that is can rarely be met. And so I wouldn't want to see people creating more humans that have to get onto this wheel of life.
Not for you personally, but externally, if you're successful in getting less people to breed and procreate, would it have been better for you to have been born personally?
I think your question is assuming whether my life has some external value to others. And remember, that's not the question I've been asking.
No. I'm not talking about I'm talking externally now, the impact that you have on others.
But that's exactly the point. Is you're not asked. You can ask two questions about any one life. Was it good for that person to have been brought into existence?
Yeah, that's not what I'm asking.
Was it good for others?
Yes.
And I'm not denying that if you have a child, that child can be good for you. I've never denied that. Mm-hmm. And I don't deny that some people can do good for others beyond perhaps even their own family. I do think that there's often a worry about whether people do more good than they do bad. And so my misanthropic argument spells out a lot of ways in which humans do a lot of damage. And so there's a big debit there that has to be offset. And my suspicion is that relatively few people offset the damage that they do.
On that note, David Benatar, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
In our discussion, our original discussion, you pointed out that there was a misunderstanding, and so we thought it would be best just to append some correction onto the end of the interview to clarify one or 2 points. So, David, take it away.
Thank you. Yes, when I listened to the recording of our initial discussion, it became clear to me what the point was at which we were speaking past one another and why we were speaking past one another. And so I thought it might be helpful just to get a clarification about that. So I think that what was going on was that there was a slippage between speaking about two different states of the world and speaking about what is better for a particular individual. So at certain times, for example, you said you were comparing two universes. Another point, you said you'd like to live in a universe where there were people who were experiencing things and positive things. And you said you liked the idea of people exploring. And these all suggest that you prefer one state of the universe to another state of the universe. And I didn't entirely pick up that that's what you were meaning, because at other points you were speaking in terms of what is better or worse for the person who's brought into existence. But upon hearing this, it became clear to me that I think was where we were speaking past one another. So if I'd return to the case of the 12-year-old girl, remember, with a non-identity problem. And so the two scenarios where she either conceives a child now, which would have a worse quality of life, or she waits and at a much later stage conceives a child which would have a much better quality of life. And of course, these are different children that exist in these two scenarios. And because the alternative, let's say, to conceiving the child now when she's 12 is that child never gets conceived, it's very hard to say that child is worse off as a result of being conceived, because the alternative scenario is that the child would not have been conceived at all, would not have existed at all. Mm-hmm. And so those people who think that being harmed is a condition in which you're worse off than you would otherwise have been, have difficulty in saying what is being done wrong to this child by conceiving the child. Mm-hmm. But of course, if you take a more impersonal position, if you're really comparing just states of the universe, And in one state, she can have a child that's worse off, and in another state, she can have a child that's better off. It's easy to say that the state in which she has a child that's better off is going to be the better of the two worlds.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the question that I'm looking at. The question I'm looking at is whether coming into existence is good or bad for the person who is brought into existence. And to answer that question, I think what you need to do is expunge from your mind questions about which are better states of the universe. And when you do that, then I think my argument becomes more compelling.
Mm-hmm.
Or it'll sound more compelling, because that's exactly what the argument is about.
But so how do you do that? What should I be thinking of? What's the model that I should be adopting instead of that?
Good, thanks. So I think that this is where things are difficult, because ordinarily when we do think about questions of harm and benefit, we are thinking about two states of a person. So somebody's in a particular condition, they then get, let's say, knocked over by a car, and now they're in a worse off position. And so we want to say, well, being knocked over harmed that person. But when we're dealing with cases of coming into existence and also going out of existence, but especially coming into existence, we don't have two states in which the person exists. And so if one insists that to be better off or to be worse off, there must be two states of the person that we compare, then I think you're going to run into difficulties. Mm-hmm. And I'm resistant to that. I would say that if we're dealing with an unusual kind of case, then we shouldn't be Procrustean in our philosophical response to it. In other words, we shouldn't try to force this into the usual categories. We need to recognize that there is something different going on here, and we need to treat it accordingly. And mm-hmm. So when I compare these two worlds, one in which a person exists and one in which a person doesn't exist, and I ask which of those is better for the person who we're considering bringing into existence. So it's not a question of which states of the world are better, but mm-hmm. which is better for the person who we might bring into existence, or we do bring into existence. What we need to do is compare each of those scenarios in terms of the interests of the person who exists only in one of them. Now, that's a difficult concept to get one's head around, but we do this kind of thing for decisions about ending life. So sometimes people are suffering unbearably, and they reach the conclusion that they would be better off dead, all things considered. Now, when you say better off dead, you don't mean that once they're dead, they will actually be, and therefore they will be in a better position. I think what we're saying there is that if we compare continued life with the scenario in which the person has ceased to exist, and we're judging these two scenarios by the interests of the person who exists only in the one scenario, we're going to say that the state in which they don't exist any longer is the less bad of these two scenarios. Now, it's a little less difficult in the case of ceasing to exist, because in those cases, there has already been somebody who we can refer to, as it were. So it's more complicated in the case of bringing somebody into existence, because if we decide never to bring that person into existence, then there will never be a person of that kind. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't stop us thinking about counterfactuals. We can still think, even about people that we never brought into existence. We can still think that we could have brought them into existence. Mm-hmm. Or if it's a prospective case, we can think about the possibility if we do bring them into existence. And there again, what I want to do is make a judgment of that scenario, let's say the one where they do exist and the one where they don't exist, and compare those two in terms of the interests of the person who exists in only one of them.
Mm-hmm. So in the case of someone who we're making a decision about whether they should continue existing, so someone who's on life support or in severe pain or those sorts of scenarios, we are actually we have a choice, right? There is the case in which continuing to live would potentially be better. And so it's a serious choice. It's not one where it's always the case you want to switch off the machine, let's say. So why, when we reverse it and you go from non-existence into existence rather than the other way around, why is it in that case that you have this asymmetry that doesn't appear to always exist in the case where you're switching off a life or deciding whether to continue a life or not?
Oh, I think it's precisely because in the ceasing to exist case, we actually have a person. There's somebody who exists. And in my view, once you exist, you've got an interest in continuing to exist. And so now what you're doing is you're wanting to make a determination about whether the interest in avoiding whatever evils there are within your life are sufficient to outweigh the interest in continuing to exist. But the reason why it's so much clearer in a case where the person does not yet exist is that they have zero interest in coming into existence. They lose absolutely nothing by not starting to exist.
I think, okay, this is helpful. Okay, sorry for interrupting you. So let me try to translate what I think you're saying. And what I think you're saying is that because we exist, we're evolved creatures, and because we're evolved creatures, we have an interest to continue existing, and it would cause us pain to go through the process of going into non-existence or to think of that process. We are better off as existing creatures to continue existing. Whereas if we had never existed, we don't have that evolved mechanism in place. We just simply don't exist. Is that
I wouldn't put it quite in the way you've put it, because I think that even less evolved, if you want to use that expression, I mean, that's a controversial expression to use. I don't think, for example, that chameleons are less evolved than we are. So it depends exactly on how you're using the word evolved. But I think that sentient life forms that don't have our degree of sapience can have interests in continuing to exist. They might not be as strong as our interest in continuing to exist, but they could nonetheless have interest in continuing to exist. So what the explanation is for why you have the interest, that's another question. The bare point I want to make now is that once you exist, you've got an interest in continuing to exist. And so there's something that has to be defeated. And it can sometimes be defeated. If the quality of your life becomes sufficiently bad, then it can be defeated. But there's nothing that needs to be defeated in the case of coming into existence, because there's no interest in coming into existence. And whereas if you are brought into existence, we know that you will suffer all kinds of harms. So these are harms that are avoidable to this person, and they're avoidable without cost to this person. And therefore, it's going to be better not to bring them into existence.
So let me ask you then, so I think I understand the position better now. Let me ask you then, just in terms of, so I want to get a little bit more empirical here and then ask, what kind of evidence would it take you to revise your antinatalist position, or to think that it is worth bringing into existence people on balance, to start a life on balance?
Well, remember, part of my argument is axiological, but that's not the part that gets you all the way to antinatalism. And then part is empirical. So as I think I explained last time, my view is that so long as there is any harm in a life, it's not in the interests of a being to come into existence. And so one thing, if we lived in a world in which somebody came into existence and they never suffered any harm, and we knew that in advance that they would never suffer any harm and could never suffer any harm, then I'd become indifferent to bringing somebody into existence. But I just think that is an impossible world, and that's never going to happen. But now if we turn to the empirical questions, if it could be shown that the amount of bad in lives is really minuscule, and the benefit to creating people for others is sufficiently great, then I'd say, okay, that's a world in which I would not judge procreation to be immoral. But again, I think that's not a world that's actually possible, because I think that harm is just so deeply ingrained in the structure of existence and sentient existence that we don't live in a world like that. There are always going to be serious harms. And one of those harms is death. That's a pretty serious harm. Most people hold that view. We did discuss a bit last time, the Epicureans who don't. But it's hard to see people really leading their lives, really taking on this idea that death is nothing to us. Most people take death to be a pretty serious matter, and that's something that befalls everybody.
So let me ask then. One thing that we didn't touch on is, and it's something I've been speaking about in the last week since this interview with friends, and that is there are these new studies in places like Denmark and Iceland where they find that when they reduce the number of working days per week from 5 to 4, that productivity stays about the same, but people are happier and live with less stress in their lives. And so what I'm curious to know is, how far away do you think we are from living stress-free lives, right? Or pain-free? I know that you use, these good and bad labels as sort of catch-alls, but how far away really are we from the sort of life where you would say, yeah, on balance, it makes sense? Do you think we're so far away that it's unethical to attempt to get to that position? And here I'm pointing towards studies from like Hans Rosling and Steven Pinker and these sort of researchers who think that objectively the world is getting better on many metrics. I know in our last discussion you talked about absolute numbers. The important thing is the absolute suffering rather than the relative amount of suffering. I think you said, but yeah, that's sort of what I'd like to know. Where do you think we are on the road?
Far away. I think people underestimate it. Sometimes these are people who are young and vigorous, and they don't know what's coming. But think about somebody. I know of somebody now who's young and was vigorous and had a stroke, and is now having difficulty speaking and walking. Now, imagine, I don't know what's going to happen in this particular case, but think about cases where somebody has a stroke and they're not unable to speak, to communicate for the rest of their life. Just consider how frustrating that is. Now, believe it or not, this happens in Denmark too. I'm being facetious here, obviously. But,
of course.
So in the best of conditions, in the best of places where the quality of life is as good as it can be, people can face fates like this. They can be knocked down and have broken bones and be paralyzed, and people still go through divorces and their children get ill, and there are any number of awful fates that can do befall people, even in the very best of places.
And your position is that it's these cases, which I would say, I mean, death happens to everyone, but strokes don't happen to everyone, right? On balance, they're happening to some.
No, but then other things hit them. So, for example, when you get a decline in deaths from infectious diseases, you find people live longer, and then you have many more deaths from cancers. And you might say, well, look, someday somebody's going to find a cure for cancer. Perhaps, but then people are going to die of other things, and we don't know how horrific those deaths are going to be. And this is fundamentally because the badness is so deeply embedded in the structure of life. If it's not one thing that gets you, it's going to be another. And these fates are pretty awful when you actually live through them, or if you see other people living through them. And what you do when you create a child is you're saying, I'm creating a being who's vulnerable to all of these things. That's a pretty horrific decision to make on somebody's behalf. Now, you can make that decision on somebody's behalf if they've got an interest in, say, continuing to exist. So you're deciding for your child whether to subject it to painful medical treatment that will save the child's life. That's not an unreasonable decision. But when the child is a prospective child and it has zero interest in coming into existence, why would you possibly decide to create that child when it becomes vulnerable to awful fates?